purposes.
The member for Indi.
Mr Speaker, I move that this bill be now read a second time. This, for me, is important legislation, and I call on the government to bring it on for debate. Transport, and particularly rail transport, together with telecommunications, are central tenants for those of us who live outside the regional city in terms of infrastructure. And in my electorate, after years of being a safe seat and political inaction, it's very, very hard for us to manage the two problems we've got with public transport, particularly our rail and our telecommunications. So, as an effective local and independent member of parliament, I'm very pleased to be able to represent my community with this private member's bill. So today I present this particular legislation in this place. Later on in the Federation Chamber, I'm going to be talking about another aspect of public transport, the problems we have with the Australian Rail Track Corporation and its maintenance of our Melbourne to Albury train line. Last week I spoke about the importance of a vision and the need for high-speed rail connecting Australia. And a couple of weeks ago, when we were last year, I talked about the need for a charter of budget honesty, so that when government brings legislation to this House, it actually pays attention to the impact on rural and regional Australia. And so today's legislation is a very specific example when I ask the government to pay particular attention to its infrastructure and how that impacts on rural and regional people. So, in presenting this legislation, it's an amendment to the Infrastructure Australia Act 2008, and the purpose of the bill is to strengthen the social and community benefit considerations that are assessed when Infrastructure Australia looks at value of infrastructure projects, when it audits existing infrastructure and it compiles lists of infrastructure priorities and develops infrastructure plans. The amendment requires Infrastructure Australia to consult with the community when developing corporate plans and to consider the future needs of users when providing advice to the Minister, the Commonwealth, State, Territory and local governments and investors in infrastructure and owners of infrastructure. Mr Speaker, one would think this was obvious. One would think that people are at the centre of everything we do. And it used to be that way in rural and regional Australia. It used to be that way that we had strong governments and oppositions that put people first. But we've moved. We've moved to a case where money, return on investment, the finances and the market drives us, rather than putting people first. So what I'm proposing in this legislation is that we bring the two together, that of course the market's important, of course the economy is important, but equally so are people. And we are skilled and clever enough to be able to join it at the hip. So that's what this infrastructure bill's about. We do the economics, we do the finance, and we consult with people, and we make sure that in the long term the people's needs are addressed exactly the same way as we make sure that the economic roles are addressed. So, Mr Speaker, the role of Infrastructure Australia is to provide advice on nationally significant infrastructure priorities, and the current Act has a strong focus on the economic and productivity considerations in infrastructure. However, little attention is paid to the social benefits of these proposals. This bill amends the Infrastructure Act 2008 to require Infrastructure Australia to evaluate the social and community benefits of infrastructure projects and to give equal treatment to the economic and productivity gains. The intent is that, by Infrastructure Australia assessing the social benefits of infrastructure projects by benefit connectivity, including public transport, would be considered a priority for rural and regional Australia, as well as freight movement. Now, I just want to say that again because it's really, really important. Connectivity. The current proposal on the list for Infrastructure Australia is that we build an inland rail route, which has got great support, really important. But what we need to understand is the connection between freight rail and passenger rail. And the real concern that I have is that freight rail, because of its economic consequences, will get precedence and priority over passenger rail. And we already have enough problems in my electorate in northern Victoria with passenger rail. And we don't want to see it become worse because freight rail gets priority. So under the current arrangements, Infrastructure Australia consideration is heavily weighted towards the economic productivity gains of infrastructure and does not fully account for the social and community needs. The current infrastructure priority list includes many rail projects, and among those in rural and regional Australia, the focus is only on improving freight movement and not providing passenger service. And the driver for infrastructure outside of capital cities is measured in economic terms and not social good. This is unlike projects in the city, which largely focus on easing urban congestion, for example, or clear social benefit. So we need the same level of judgment for our country people as we do for our city. And the example that I bring before the House is the Inland Rail project, currently on the priority list, and it should deliver improved passenger service as well as part of its social benefit, as well as improved economic services. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, in bringing this to the House and in bringing this bill on, it's part of what I'm actually calling on the government to pay attention to. And it's what is its vision for rural and regional Australia? What is the legacy that the government wants to leave, this particular government wants to leave when it's finished its term in Parliament? And sure, we want economic development, but much, much more important than just doing the economy, we want an enhanced social and community environment. We want an environment where the people of Australia, just like the opposition speaker has just said, trust the government, because we believe that the government has got our social and community needs driving at the centre of its policy. So part of my work as a local, independent and effective member of parliament is to bring to this parliament private members' bills that say, government, when you're doing legislation, consult with the community and then tell the community that you've actually understood how this impacts on us. So there are two particular examples that I just want to briefly touch on. Later on this week, the government's going to be talking about its childcare legislation, the omnibus legislation. And there's just so many examples within that omnibus legislation where rural and regional issues have not been taken care of, where the government hasn't done its homework to look at the unintended consequences on rural and regional Australia. But I have to say what makes me so frustrated is when I see legislation, really important legislation that's going to help us with our inland freight, that nobody in the system, and I particularly call on the board of Infrastructure Australia, to actually do a report, to actually talk to us communities about how you've worked out the connectivity with our communities and how inland freight is actually going to work with passenger rail and give us over 50 and 60 and maybe even 100 years an integrated system of transport that actually works for us. So, in bringing my comments to a close, I, in my office and my staff, and I acknowledge my staff who are here today and thank them for the work, we can see the problem, and we're amateurs in this. To the professionals, to those in Infrastructure Australia and to the board, can we ask you to bring your expertise to this particular issue, and in your designing of rural and regional infrastructure, make sure that you put the people at the centre and that you measure it and you do your audits for the long term to make sure that there is true and real benefit for those of us who are going to benefit from the economics. We also want to benefit through our community life and through our, in this case, public transport. So thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to present this private member's bill. I'll look forward to working with the minister and bringing it for debate at a later time.
I thank the member for Indies. The motion seconded. The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I support and second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
I thank the member for Mayo.